Hey, welcome back, everybody, to another episode of Time Out for Black History. I've been on a bit of a hiatus for the last probably month or so, but I'm looking to begin sharing some good information and hopefully helping people see the world a little bit differently. So today I was hoping to talk a little bit about the 13th Amendment. So we just recently saw the passage of a law making Juneteenth a federal holiday, and there's been a lot of celebration around that. And I just wanted to talk a little bit about not so much about Juneteenth, not so much about whether we should see this as a great thing, an okay thing, or a terrible thing. But more so about the 13th Amendment in and of itself, because that's what we're essentially celebrating. We're celebrating the end of slavery. So I want to just touch base a little bit about how that came about, the significance of it, and kind of the legacy of it. And so when we think about the abolition of slavery in America, and we think about the fact that there had been abolitionist societies from the very outset of America, already in 1776, 1780, 1790, Benjamin Rush was the founder of the first abolitionist, society in America. There'd always been that kind of push, predominantly from the South, from the North, to try and, break off that piece of what had become America. So it picked up some steam, and you think about, different things that happened. Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin is going to really bring a lot of information about the fugitive slave law, about what it was like, the institution of slavery in America. You had people like John Brown and John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry that brings a lot of awareness about those people who believed that the only way to end this institution was through bloodshed. So the Civil War breaks out, and the Civil War, again, as you all know, was caused by several events, several things, slavery being one of them, but also states' rights, which some would say is connected to slavery, because that's what was the major thing that represented that idea of states' rights, but also about representation and the fact that it was about power and control. The North had it, the South didn't. And so, this had been, my point here being that this wasn't a brand new concept or idea of liberating the slaves. This had been something that in America had been discussed for, the 100 years prior to the actual emancipation. So in 1863, Lincoln proposes and passes and gives the Emancipation Proclamation, essentially freeing slaves in all non-border states. So in and of itself already, that's telling you, this wasn't a purely altruistic motivation. He didn't free all slaves. He freed all slaves in states that had seceded. So the border states, which still owned slaves, he didn't free those slaves. And in many ways, this was a symbolic gesture, because slaves were not freed in southern states until, of course, the Union Army marched in and liberated them. So even though the Emancipation Proclamation says in 1863 that blacks are free, we're not going to see that actually take place in any context until 1865. So Congress begins to push. You start seeing a push in Congress for a law trying to bring an end to the institution of slavery. In 1864, we see the Senate pass a bill that would abolish the institution of slavery. Unfortunately, it dies in the House. And we're going to talk political parties in this little discussion, and it's important that you understand that the term Democrat and the term Republican do not mean today what they meant in 1865. When we think about a political party, we think about the ideologies attached to that political party and what that political party stands for, who it stands for. And so the idea of Democrat and Republican have taken different contexts throughout history. The Democrats in, 1880 were the Ku Klux Klan, were the white supremacists of their time. Okay, all the way up and through 1930, 1940, Democrats in the South represented that group of people. Republicans following the war, Republicans were the ones that were advocating for equality for blacks. Radical Republicans were fighting for the right to vote, all those kind of things. And we're going to see a shift at different moments in history. A major shift would be when we see the South turn red in the 1970s, and a lot of that has to do with arguments and fights over segregation. And this the formation of political parties like the Dixiecrats, as they broke away from the Democrats because the Democrats began supporting equality, voting rights, desegregating the military, all that kind of stuff. Now, again, this isn't me taking a position that the Democrats have been, absolutely wonderful on race relations at all. But I'm trying to give those that try and argue a very simplistic, third grade argument of, Lincoln was a Republican, why don't black people love Republicans? It's not that simple, and it's important that we understand it's not that simple. So back to this kind of, 13th Amendment. So it doesn't get through the democratically controlled House. So Lincoln gets reelected in 1964, and even though we're going to see a shift in the House and Senate becoming more Republican, Lincoln doesn't want to wait that long. He knows that if he waits a little bit, the 13th Amendment will pass a Republican-controlled Congress. But he basically says, we're not going to wait that long. Democrats, you guys can do it with us now, or you can wait, and we'll get it through eventually. But why wait on something that should end already? So it basically, they're going to need to turn a lot of Democrats. And there's two ways of doing that. They can either have the Democrats end up voting for the 13th Amendment, or he can have the Democrats abstain from voting, which lowers the threshold of number of voters that have to approve you. So you need a 2/3 majority. And so that golden ticket mark was like 116 that you needed. And so, Lincoln, this isn't going to be, our politics don't run on altruism again. There's a lot of corruption in our political system, a lot of back scratching, all that good stuff. So Lincoln realizes that and Seward, who's the Secretary of State, realize that they're going to need to scratch a lot of backs. So they play the power play against a lot of Republicans and basically strong-arm the Republicans into supporting the 13th Amendment. And more importantly, they're going to need the support of roughly around 25 Democrats, which in the first vote, they had 2 Democrats. So this is going to be a huge switch. So the first Democrats they're going to target are the lame duck Democrats. These are Democrats who already lost their seats and basically are just kind of going out with whatever they're going out with. And patronage jobs, meaning you're about to lose your career, we'll hook you up with a job like postmaster of this area. And so they're able to kind of bribe, is a good word, a lot of Democrats into voting to support the 13th Amendment. But they also get some Democrats to abstain from voting, meaning they just don't take a position on it. And so they're able to get 8 Democrats to abstain. They get 16 Democrats to vote yes. Now, 14 of those 16 were lame duck Democrats, meaning they had nothing to lose politically. And so one of the things that this reveals to me a lot is that our political system is not based on right and wrong. Our political system is not based on what's best for America. Our political system is based on politics. And many of our congressmen and women vote based on what's going to keep them in office during their next term. And so, which again, you got to understand, I understand that, but it also helps me understand why we don't always make the right decisions in America. So the amendment passes. We end up with 119 votes, 3 more than what was needed in order to get the bill passed. So it's signed by Lincoln, everybody celebrates. But again, understand that this wasn't a decision by the United States of America on an altruistic, moral stance that America, should get rid of slavery. There was a lot of bargaining, a lot of, nuancing, a lot of bribery, a lot of things that had to happen in order to get this bill passed. But it passes. And so we see the end of slavery in America. Now, 27 of the 36 states ended up ratifying the Constitution immediately, ratifying the 13th Amendment. Okay. It took some other states some time. Some other states did it in 1866, some more in the early 1870s. Kentucky did it in 1976. Mississippi being the last state to ratify it in 1995. That's a long time to ratify the 13th Amendment. So not everybody was on board, and it's going to become quite prevalent afterward when we see what happens as a result. One of the reasons I have a problem with celebrating the 13th Amendment and celebrating Juneteenth and celebrating those things is because I know what came after. And I know that of the 4.5 million black people that lived in America in 1860, about 4% of them lived outside the South. 4% lived outside the South. The other 96% existed in southern states. Immediately after the 13th Amendment is passed, we see the establishment of black codes in all of those southern states. And I'm going to do a whole nother talk on kind of black codes, but basically these were ways to reinstall the system of white supremacy in these southern states. Economic, political, social, everything. Also, in all of these southern states, there was a system brought in called the Convict Lease system, which in most ways replaced the institution of slavery. I'll give you an example. Alabama. 73% of Alabama's state revenue came from the convict lease system. 70% of those incarcerated in Alabama were black Americans. That's up from 33% 10 years earlier. This system was it was so bad, eventually it was ruled unconstitutional. But it dominated America up through the 1910s, 1920s, 1930s. And so, to me, it's very hard celebrating the end of a system that just created an equally disturbing system. Now, those of you that might say, hey, what are you complaining about? Segregation and black codes and convict lease system? That's way better than slavery. Again, you don't understand what those systems were and what those systems did. There's no celebrating the convict lease system. There's no celebrating segregation. There's no celebrating black codes. Thank you.